The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, which was the cruelest kind of day for news like that, because Tuesday held no ceremony and offered no comfort, just the flat and ordinary continuation of a world that had already decided to move on without asking Jennie Boone's permission. She had been standing on the platform of the Abilene station in the summer of 1879, her trunk at her feet and a bouquet of dried wildflowers in her hands, the kind a woman carries when she is trying to look hopeful rather than terrified. The Kansas heat pressed down on everything like a wool blanket left too long in the sun, and the air smelled of coal smoke and horse, and the particular dust that the plains stirred up when the wind came through in long, indifferent sweeps. Jennie had ridden 3 days by rail from St. Louis, and before that, a hard week's journey by wagon from the small Tennessee valley where she had grown up and where she had answered the advertisement in the newspaper with a careful, deliberate hand. Wanted, a wife of good character and industry. I am a man of modest means with a cattle operation outside Harlan Creek, Kansas. I am 29 years of age, honest in my dealings, and have a house that wants tending and a table that wants conversation. Write to Thomas Wells, Harlan Creek, Kansas. She had written to Thomas Wells. He had written back twice. The letters were plain but decent, the handwriting of a man who had not been overly schooled but had applied himself to the task with serious intent. He had told her his land sat at the edge of a creek with cottonwood trees along the bank, and that the sunsets out there were the kind that made a person feel small in a way that was not unpleasant. She had liked that. She had read that line 4 times. She was 24 years old and had no particular future waiting for her in Tennessee. Her mother had passed 2 winters prior. Her father had remarried a woman with 3 daughters of her own, and the house that Jennie had grown up in had quietly become a house that belonged to someone else. She was not bitter about it. She was practical. She looked at the advertisement the way a person looks at a door when the room behind them has already gone dark, and she stepped through. She had not expected to fall in love through letters, but she had expected at the very least to find something real, a life, a man who meant what he said, a place that could become home. And so she was standing on that platform in Abilene with her dried wildflowers and her trunk and her practical heart, ready to do the work of being brave, when she saw the man coming toward her across the platform and understood immediately that something was wrong. He was not Thomas. She knew that without having been told. He carried none of the particular ease she had imagined in the man who had written about cottonwood sunsets. This man moved like someone who had not slept and did not expect to sleep, his hat pulled low against the glare, his jaw set in the particular way of a person carrying a weight that has not been distributed evenly and probably cannot be. He was perhaps a year or 2 older than Thomas would have been, though it was hard to say with certainty. He had the same dark hair that Thomas had described himself as having, the same strong build that the prairie seemed to grow as naturally as it grew wheat, but everything else about him was different. Where the letters had suggested a man of quiet contentment, this man looked like contentment had excused itself from the room some time ago and left something rower in its place. He stopped in front of her and took his hat off, which was the gesture that told her everything before a single word was spoken, because men in 1879 Kansas did not remove their hats for a casual greeting in the open sun. "Miss Boone," he said, and his voice was low and steady in the way that people make their voices steady when they are working very hard to hold something together. "My name is Owen Wells. I'm Thomas's brother." She looked at him. The dried wildflowers in her hands suddenly felt absurd, and she did not know what to do with them. "Where is Thomas?" she asked, though some part of her already knew. The knowing had arrived before the words, the way thunder arrives after lightning that has already done its damage. Owen Wells looked at a point somewhere past her left shoulder, and she watched his jaw work once, and then he looked back at her with eyes that were a very dark brown and full of something she could not quite name except to call it the particular suffering of a man who is doing the worst errand of his life. "Thomas passed 6 days ago," he said. "There was a fever. It came on fast. I'm sorry. He stopped, started again. There wasn't time to send word before you'd already be on the train, and I didn't want you to receive news like that from a stranger at some depot along the way. I thought it was better to come myself. Jennie Boone stood very still on that platform in the Kansas heat, and the world did not crack open the way she might have expected. It simply continued. The coal smoke kept drifting. The horse traffic kept moving along the street beyond the station. A child somewhere behind her laughed at something, and the laughter went on too long, the way children's laughter does when it has no understanding of the occasion. She felt Owen Wells watching her. She felt, too, that he did not know where to look, that he had come all this way to do the right thing, and now that he had done it, the aftermath of it was something he had not fully planned for, because he had nowhere left to look that wasn't the face of the woman who had come to marry his dead brother. How old was he? She asked, because it was the first thing her mind produced. 29, Owen said. Same as he told you, he just turned it. She nodded once. The wildflowers were still in her hands. He spoke of you, Owen said then quietly, like he felt he owed her something beyond the news. He showed me your letters. He was glad you'd written. He talked about you like you were already something real to him. That was what undid her just slightly. Not the death itself, which was too large and too strange to feel yet, but the smallness of that she had been something real to a man she had never met, and now both the man and the becoming real were gone at the same time. She pressed her lips together hard and looked past Owen Wells at the Kansas sky, which was enormous and very blue and utterly without sympathy. I have nowhere to go, she said. It was not a bid for pity. It was a statement of fact delivered by a practical woman taking inventory of her situation. My trunk is here. I used nearly all my savings for the journey. I cannot go back to Tennessee, and I don't know anyone in Abilene. Owen Wells put his hat back on, adjusted the brim, and then seemed to make a decision the way a man makes a decision when all the other options have already been eliminated. The farm is still there, he said. Thomas's place. It was his outright left to him from our father. I've been running it the last 6 days, keeping the cattle watered and the house from falling apart. He paused. I don't know what happens to it legally yet, but I know it's still there and there's a room in it, and if you need somewhere to stay while you figure your situation, then that's what I can offer you. It's not much, but it's something honest. She looked at him then, really looked at him, the way she had not permitted herself to look since he had removed his hat. He was not handsome in any easy or polished way. He was the kind of man who looked like he had been put together for usefulness rather than admiration, with a face that had been worked on by sun and wind until it had an honesty to it that softer faces lacked. He had a scar along his jaw, small and old, and his hands where they held his hat were the hands of a man who had spent his 20s in hard labor and did not regret it. He was watching her back with those dark eyes, and she understood that he was not offering the room as a kindness exactly, or not only as a kindness. He was offering it because he genuinely did not know what else to do, and because Thomas would have expected it of him, and because he was a man who lived according to what was expected rather than what was convenient. All right, she said. Thank you. He picked up her trunk without being asked. She kept the dried wildflowers in her hands because she could not think of what else to do with them. The wagon ride to Harlan Creek took most of the afternoon. The land was flat in the way that only Kansas is flat, a flatness so total that it became its own kind of vastness, the sky enormous overhead, and the horizon so far away it seemed theoretical. The creek cottonwoods appeared while they were still half a mile off, a bright line of green against all that dry gold, and Jennie remembered Thomas writing about them, and felt the strange doubling of a grief she had no real right to and a recognition that was entirely hers. Owen drove. She sat beside him on the wagon bench with her hands in her lap. They did not speak much. What they said was practical. The wagon hit a rut and he warned her of it a second too late. She apologized for crying once when the full weight of the situation briefly caught up with her, and he said there was nothing to apologize for. She asked how long he had been working the ranch, and he told her 3 years off and on, that he had his own smaller claim about 8 miles east but had been staying at Thomas's since the fever. At one point, riding in silence through the long afternoon, a red-tailed hawk rode a thermal above them, and they both watched it for a while without saying anything, and that was easier than talking. The house was a single-story frame structure with a covered porch and a kitchen garden that needed attention. It was modest and real, and it smelled of the particular combination of wood and earth and old coffee that houses accumulate when they've been properly lived in. There was a parlor with 2 chairs and a Franklin stove, a kitchen with a good iron range, 2 bedrooms, and a back porch that looked out over the creek. Jennie put her trunk in the smaller bedroom and stood in it for a moment looking at the bare walls and the iron bedstead with its patchwork quilt and the square window that framed a piece of Kansas evening, and she thought, "This is where I am. This is the actual place where I am." She heard Owen in the kitchen, the sounds of a man making coffee because it was the one definite and useful thing he could do, and she thought about the strange logic of the situation, that she had come to this house for one Wells' brother and was standing in it because of the other. She came out into the kitchen and sat at the table, and he put a cup of coffee in front of her without asking whether she wanted it, which she appreciated. He sat across from her with his own cup, and they drank for a moment in the particular silence that comes after the worst of something has been said. "How did you come to answer the advertisement?" he asked. He was not prying. He was making conversation because the silence had reached its limit, and because she was beginning to understand, a man who found it easier to ask questions than to offer himself in any directly emotional way. She told him about Tennessee and her mother and her father's remarriage. She told him about reading the advertisement and deciding on it the way you decide on a path when you're standing at the edge of a wood and the light is going. She told him she had liked the line about the sunsets. He wasn't wrong about the sunsets, Owen said, looking at the kitchen window where the sky was in fact doing something extravagant in orange and amber. Thomas had a way of saying the right thing. He was better with words than I am. "Are you the older brother?" she asked. "By 14 months, he said. Though Thomas always acted older, he had a settled quality. I was the one who went looking for trouble when we were young. Did you find it?" He looked at her with something that might have been the very earliest precursor to a smile. Enough of it to learn that it's easier to find than to get rid of. She slept heavily that first night, the way the body insists on sleep when the mind has taken on more than it can process in daylight. When she woke, the house was already warm with morning and she could hear Owen outside, the sounds of the ranch beginning, a horse being led, a bucket being set down, the rhythmic work of a man who understood that the day's needs did not pause for grief or confusion. She got up and started the stove and made breakfast, because it was something practical she could do, and because she was not the kind of woman who could lie in a bed while there was work requiring doing. She made biscuits and fried the salt pork she found in the larder and put coffee on. And when Owen came in, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table as if he had not quite expected it. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted something useful to do." He sat down and ate with the focused appreciation of a man who had been feeding himself adequately but without pleasure for some days. She found she liked watching him eat. It was an uncomplicated satisfaction. In the days that followed, they fell into a routine the way 2 careful, practical people will when they find themselves in an unusual circumstance and are mutually determined not to make it worse. She kept the house. She worked the kitchen garden, which was a tangle of neglect but had good bones under it, good soil that had been tended before the fever came and interrupted everything. Owen worked the cattle and mended what needed mending and came in for meals, and in the evenings sometimes sat on the back porch and they talked, or didn't, depending on the day. She learned things about him gradually, the way you learn a country, not all at once but through repeated exposure, small details accumulating into a larger picture. He had fought in the tail end of the war as a very young man, just old enough to be conscripted, and he did not speak of it directly, but it had left marks she could read in certain silences, and in the way he sometimes went very still when things got too loud or too sudden. He had come west with Thomas after the war, following their father who had taken a land claim in Kansas and built the first version of what was now Thomas's farm. The father had died 8 years prior. Their mother had stayed in Missouri and was still living there, and Owen wrote to her regularly, and the letters he produced were careful and considered in a way his ordinary speech was not. He had never married. He had come close once, he said one evening, a woman in a town called Sawyer who had eventually chosen someone with better prospects, and he had understood her reasoning even if it had taken him a while to stop minding it. "Do you still mind it?" Jennie asked. "No," he said, and it had the sound of a truth that had been examined enough times to be certain of itself. "I think some things happen exactly as much as they were going to happen and not a fraction more. She found the right life for her. I found," he gestured at the porch, the creek, the darkening sky. Whatever this is," she echoed. He looked at her sideways with those dark eyes, and she looked away at the cottonwoods along the creek, which were moving in the evening breeze with a soft, continuous sound like someone turning pages in a large book. The legal question of the farm resolved itself by the end of the second week. Thomas had left no will, which was common enough for a man of 29 who had not yet developed the habit of anticipating his own mortality. Owen rode into Harlan Creek and spoke with the county clerk, a man named Purvis who wore spectacles and a general air of patient resignation, and came back with the information that as Thomas's sole surviving immediate kin, Owen was the inheritor of the property. He told her this on the back porch that evening, and she felt the ground shift slightly under her situation. "So what happens to me?" she asked. She did not ask it with self-pity. She asked it the way she asked most things, directly and without theatrical embellishment. "Nothing unless you decide something," Owen said. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need to. I'm not going to put a woman alone on the road in the middle of Kansas because the law handed me a property. That's not something I'd do." "I know it isn't," she said, because she did know it after 2 weeks of watching him be exactly the kind of man he was. "But I should think about what comes next. I should find work. There must be something in Harlan Creek. A school or a seamstress who needs help, or there's a school," he said. "Teacher left in the spring. I heard Purvis saying they hadn't replaced her." She looked at him. "You heard that? I hear things." "Did you hear it specifically, or did you hear it in the way a person hears things when they are keeping an ear out for a particular kind of information?" The silence that followed was informative. "Both, maybe," he said finally. She felt something move in her chest, small and careful like a bird that has been still for a long time and is testing its wings without committing to flight. "I was a schoolteacher in Tennessee," she said, "for 2 years before I left." "I know," Owen said. "You mentioned it in one of your letters to Thomas. He showed them to me after. I'm sorry. He wanted me to know who was coming." She thought about that, about Thomas Wells reading her letters, and then sharing them with his brother because he wanted Owen to know the measure of the woman who was going to become part of their family. And then Thomas had died and Owen had come to the station, and now Owen knew her letters, and she was sitting on a dead man's porch at the edge of a Kansas evening, and something in all of it was both sadder and stranger than any future she had imagined for herself. "It's all right," she said. "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was the best man I knew," Owen said simply. They sat for a while after that without talking, and the creek murmured below the cottonwoods and the first stars came through, and neither of them moved to go inside. She went to see about the school position 3 days later. Owen drove her into Harlan Creek in the wagon, which was a small town of perhaps 200 souls and a main street with a general store, a bank, a saloon, a church, a blacksmith's operation, and a collection of other establishments that served the needs of the surrounding ranch country. Harlan Creek was the kind of town that had fully committed to the business of existing without any pretension to grandeur, and Jennie found she liked it immediately. Purvis, the county clerk, received her in his office and regarded her over his spectacles with the careful assessment of a man who has been disappointed by candidates before and is prepared to be disappointed again. She gave him her references from Tennessee, which she had thought to bring in her trunk with the foresight of a woman who had not known what she was walking into but had packed for uncertainty. She talked about her methods and her experience and the ages of children she had taught, and Purvis listened and made notes with a stub of pencil, and then said he would need to confer with the school board, which consisted of 3 ranchers who met when they could be convinced to be in the same room simultaneously. She walked out onto the main street and found Owen leaning against the wagon with his arms crossed, watching the street with the patient, habitual watchfulness of a man who had grown up on a frontier. "How did it go?" he asked. Tentatively, she said, "There is a school board. I know 2 of them," he said. She looked at him. "Is that going to help or hinder?" "Probably help," he said. "I'm on good terms with most people around here. Thomas was well liked and I've been running his operation without drama. People notice that kind of thing." She thought again about that quality he had, of doing what was expected without making a production of it. It was, she was realizing, one of the more uncommon virtues, and she had been undervaluing it. "I'd like to walk around a little," she said, "if you don't mind waiting." "Take your time," he said, and settled back against the wagon with the ease of a man who understood that waiting was part of the work. She walked the main street of Harlan Creek and went into the general store and bought a small quantity of thread and a paper of needles because she needed them, and because it was a good way to talk to people. And the woman behind the counter, who turned out to be the store owner's wife, a Mrs. Alderman, was the kind of person who asked questions as naturally as breathing. Jennie found herself explaining her situation more candidly than she had planned, though she exercised some discretion regarding the most painful elements. Mrs. Alderman responded with the frank sympathy of a woman who had lived long enough in a hard country to understand that circumstances did not always follow the neat trajectory that was planned for them. "Owen Wells is a good man," Mrs. Alderman said, as if this were directly relevant. "Solid as the ground he walks on. Thomas was too, God rest him, but Owen has a depth to him. He just doesn't wear it on the outside where anyone can easily see it." Jennie said she had noticed something along those lines. "He comes in here every few weeks," Mrs. Alderman continued, with the practiced airiness of a woman who is saying something deliberate and knows it and doesn't particularly mind being seen to know it. "Buys what he needs and says what he has to say and not a word more. But he remembers things. He remembered that my youngest had a cold back in April and asked after her in July. That's the kind of man he is." Jennie thanked Mrs. Alderman for the thread and the needles and the information, and went back out into the summer street with a feeling that she could not entirely name. Owen had not moved from his position by the wagon. He was talking to a man she didn't know, a broad, cheerful figure in a battered hat who laughed at something Owen said with the whole of his considerable body. When he saw her coming, he introduced her without hesitation. "This is Cal Briggs," he said. "He runs the spread south of Thomas's. Cal, this is Miss Jennie Boone." Cal Briggs shook her hand with a heartiness that was entirely genuine, and said it was a pleasure and that he was sorry about the circumstances, and that if she needed anything while she was getting settled, his wife Bess was the most useful woman in 3 counties and would be glad to help. "I'll remember that," Jennie said, and meant it. Riding home, she sat beside Owen in the afternoon sun and thought about the town and the school and Mrs. Alderman and Cal Briggs, and the way Owen had introduced her without any awkward preamble or qualification, just simply as Jennie Boone, as if she were already a known quantity in this place. "You introduced me," she said. "People were going to wonder who you were either way," he said. "Better to introduce you than leave them guessing. Did you think about how to introduce me before you did it?" He was quiet for a moment. "A little," he admitted. I thought about what the simplest true thing was. And what was the simplest true thing? That you were a good woman who had come a long way and was getting her bearings, he said. I didn't say all that, but that's what I thought. She looked at the road ahead, at the flat country unrolling in the afternoon heat, at the distant line of cottonwoods that marked the creek and the farm that was now legally his. Owen, she said. Yes. I think I might stay for a while if you'll still have me. I said as much, he told her. That offer didn't have an expiration. The school board met the following week, and Purvis sent a note to the farm by way of a boy on a horse, and the note said that the position was hers if she wanted it. She wrote back immediately and said she wanted it, and classes would begin in September, which gave her a month to prepare. The month went quickly and slowly simultaneously, the way months do when they contain a great deal of interior life and a great deal of exterior work. She got the schoolroom in order, cleaned and supplied, with textbooks borrowed from a church in Abilene that had a surplus, and sent them along willingly. She learned the names and situations of the families whose children would be her students, and she began to understand the social geography of the area around Harlan Creek, who was friends with whom, which families had come from where, which of the ranchers were doing well and which were struggling with the drought that had been intermittently punishing the region. She and Owen had settled into a domestic rhythm that would have looked, to an outside observer, very much like a household in which two people were accustomed to each other. He did not press her for anything. She did not ask him for more than he offered. But the evenings on the back porch had become something she looked forward to in a way that she examined with considerable private honesty. And what she found when she examined it was that she had begun to care for Owen Wells in a way that had nothing to do with practical calculation, and everything to do with the particular fact of him. It arrived gradually and then all at once, the way these things do. One evening in mid-August, she was sitting at the kitchen table going over her lesson preparations when she heard him come in from the day's work, heard the sounds of him at the washstand in the back, and she looked up from her papers and realized that the sound of him moving through the house had become, without her noticing the transition, one of the sounds that meant home. She put her pen down very carefully and sat with that for a moment. She was in the dead man's house, and she had begun to love the dead man's brother, and the whole situation was so entirely outside the boundaries of anything she had planned that it almost made her laugh, except that it was also serious in the way that real things are serious, and she was too honest with herself to treat it lightly. Owen came into the kitchen and looked at her papers and asked if she was ready for September, and she said she thought she was, and they talked for a while about the curriculum and the older students who would need more challenging material, and the whole conversation was entirely ordinary and entirely pleasant, and she was aware of him the entire time in a way that had a new quality to it, like music heard in a key you hadn't known the piece could inhabit. He noticed her noticing. She was not subtle enough to prevent it, or perhaps she was no longer trying to be. He stopped mid-sentence once and looked at her with a question in his eyes that he did not put into words, and she looked back and did not look away, and the moment stretched a little longer than it would have if they were only two people discussing a school curriculum. "Jennie," he said. "Don't," she said. "Not tonight. I'm not ready to talk about it tonight." He nodded slowly and they returned to the papers, and if the conversation was slightly different afterward, she thought they both agreed, without saying so, that it was a difference they could afford to hold for a little while longer. September came and school began, and she found that teaching in Harlan Creek was more demanding and more rewarding than teaching in Tennessee had been, partly because the children were rougher in manner but warmer in spirit, and partly because she was more herself than she had been in Tennessee, which she was only now beginning to understand. She had arrived here as a woman in transit between one life and another, and somewhere in the months, since the station platform in Abilene, she had stopped being in transit and had become someone situated. She rode into town each morning on the horse Owen had quietly prepared for her, a steady bay mare named Cora who had a calm, sensible character and seemed to understand that her rider was a person who needed reliability. Owen had not announced the arrangement of the horse. He had simply one morning indicated that Cora was saddled and available, and that she was the best-tempered animal on the property. Jennie had thanked him without making a great deal of it, because he would have been uncomfortable if she had. The children in her school ranged from 6 to 14 and came from ranch families and farming families, and the family of a man who ran a freight operation out of Harlan Creek. There were 15 of them in the single-room schoolhouse, and they were, collectively, full of a physical energy that required management. But they were also curious and capable, and Jennie found within 2 weeks that she had come to love each of them individually for very specific reasons that she kept a private mental list of. The Briggs children, Cal and Bess's too, were both sharp and competitive with each other in a way that was entertaining to observe. There was a girl of 11 named May Hollister who read at a level several years ahead of her age, and was hungry for books in a way that Jennie understood viscerally and responded to with everything she had. There was a boy named Peter who was dyslexic in a way that no one had yet identified as anything but slowness, and Jennie worked with him quietly and separately and found methods that helped him and watched the confusion on his face gradually give way to something approaching competence and then satisfaction. She talked about the children with Owen in the evenings. He listened the way he listened to most things, with a complete attention that did not interrupt itself with opinions but took everything in and produced, when she had finished, observations that were occasionally so precisely accurate that she was startled. "Peter sounds like a boy I knew," Owen said one evening when she had described the reading difficulty. "In the war, couldn't make letters sit still on a page, but he could track game through ground that would have fooled anyone else. It wasn't a matter of being slow. It was a matter of being built for a different kind of knowing." "That's exactly it," she said. "That's exactly what it is." He looked at her over his coffee and she looked at him, and between them something warm and particular lived in the quiet. The first time he touched her deliberately was not a dramatic occasion. They were on the back porch in October, the nights having gone cool enough to require a shawl, and she was looking at the creek, and she said something about the stars, and he reached over and pulled the edge of her shawl up at the shoulder where it had slipped, just that, the most practical of gestures, and then his hand stayed at her shoulder for a moment longer than the practicality required. She turned to look at him. He did not remove his hand. "I've been trying to be decent about this," he said. "I'm aware of how the whole situation looks from the outside, and I'm aware you came here for Thomas, and I've been very careful not to." "Owen," she said. "Yes. You have been decent. You have been the most decent person in my experience of this entire situation. That's part of the difficulty." He looked at her with those dark eyes in the October dark, the creek sounding below them and a horned owl somewhere among the cottonwoods making its low, rhythmic inquiry. And she thought about how she had arrived here in August of 1879, with dried wildflowers and nowhere to go, and had found, in the place she had least expected to find it, the truest sense she had ever had of being exactly where she was supposed to be. "I'm going to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to just let me say it without interrupting, because I've been working up to it for a while, and if I stop I'll overthink it and it'll be another month." "All right," he said. "I did not fall in love with Thomas Wells," she said. "I was prepared to. I was going to do everything in my power to build something real with him, but I didn't fall in love with him because I never met him. What I know of him is from letters and from what you've told me, and he sounds like he was a genuinely good man, and I mourn the life he didn't get to have. But I am not here grieving a great love. I am here grieving a possibility that turned into a different possibility." She paused. "I have fallen in love with you. It is inconvenient and strange, and I understand if it makes you uncomfortable given everything, but there it is." Owen Wells sat very still for the space of perhaps 3 breaths. Then he said, "Jennie." "Yes." "I fell in love with you," he said. somewhere around the second week of August when you came in from the garden with dirt on your hands, and you were so clearly pleased with what you'd managed to grow that you forgot to notice anything else. And I thought that was the most specific and real thing I'd seen in a very long time. She stared at him. "You've known since August," she said. "I've been being decent," he said, with a slight helpless quality to it, as if decent had been the most difficult achievement of his life. She laughed. It came out of her completely involuntarily, the laugh, and he looked startled by it for a moment, and then something cracked open in his expression and he was smiling, genuinely smiling, and it changed his whole face in a way that she had not seen before and now could not imagine not seeing. "We are both very ridiculous," she said. "We might be," he agreed. He reached up and touched her jaw with 2 fingers, a question more than anything else, and she turned toward it, and that was all the answer required. When he kissed her, it was serious and unhurried, the kiss of a man who had been waiting long enough that he was not going to waste the moment on being tentative. They sat on the back porch for a long time after that, his arm around her shoulders and her head tilted slightly toward him, and the Kansas night was enormous and cold and full of stars, and the creek talked steadily below the cottonwoods, and Jennie Boone thought that it was a peculiar and entirely beautiful thing, what life decided to do with you when you had given up trying to plan it. Through the fall they were careful in the way the community necessitated being careful. It was 1879, and Harlan Creek was a small town with conventional expectations, and Jennie was a woman who had come to marry one man and was now keeping house with his brother. And while no one had said anything outright unkind to her, she was not naive about the position she was in. Mrs. Alderman continued to be straightforwardly supportive in the way she had been from the beginning. Bess Briggs, who had become a genuine friend over the autumn months, was even more direct. "You and Owen should get married," Bess said one afternoon, sitting in Jennie's kitchen with a cup of tea and the forthright confidence of a woman who saw clearly and said what she saw. "The situation is what it is. Everyone in this county knows it. Getting married doesn't explain anything differently than what people have already worked out for themselves. It just makes it official and stops the nonsense of the few gossips who have nothing better to do." Jennie looked at her tea. "It's only been a few months. A few months in a house together is a longer knowing than a year of Sunday courtship," Bess said. "And you clearly love each other. The man looks at you like you're the reason the sun rises from the east." Jennie felt warmth move up through her face. "He does not. He absolutely does. I have seen it at church for the last 6 weeks, and so has everyone else." Bess set down her cup with the finality of a woman who has made her argument and considers the verdict obvious. "Talk to him." She thought about it for 2 days, turning it in her hands the way you turn a stone to see all its angles. And then one evening in early November, when Owen came in from checking the cattle in the first cold snap of the season, stamping the cold from his boots and accepting the coffee she put in his hands with that particular gratitude he had for warmth offered without fuss, she sat down across from him and said it directly. "Bess thinks we should get married." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at her with a steadiness she had come to trust the way you trust the solidity of good ground. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think Bess is usually right about most things," she said. "And I think, Owen, I think I want to be here. I want this to be my life. The farm and the school and the creek and you. I want you to be the person I'm building something with, if you want that too." "I want that," he said quietly. "I've wanted it long enough that it doesn't feel new anymore." "Then we should get married," she said. "Yes," he said, "we should." He reached across the table and she put her hand in his, and he turned it over and looked at it for a moment, her hand in his, and then looked up at her with those dark eyes that had, she thought, become one of the most familiar and beloved things in her world. "Jennie Boone," he said. "Owen Wells," she said. They were married on a Saturday in December 1879 in the Harlan Creek Church, which was a plain white-painted building with a potbelly stove and wooden pews worn smooth by years of Sunday use. The minister was a man named Reverend Carver, who had the practical good sense not to remark on the unusual history of the situation, and simply performed the ceremony with warmth and efficiency. Mrs. Alderman had done something remarkable with winter-dried flowers and pine boughs, and the church looked genuinely beautiful in a modest, honest way that felt exactly right. Cal Briggs stood up for Owen. Bess Briggs stood with Jennie, and between the two of them the warmth in that small church was sufficient against the December cold. The children from the school were there in a collective cluster, Peter among them, looking scrubbed and serious in the way children look when they have been told to behave at an important occasion. Jennie wore the best dress she had brought in her trunk, a deep blue wool that had seemed practical for traveling, but turned out also to be exactly the right color for a December wedding in a small Kansas church. Owen wore a suit that he had clearly not worn often, and that was slightly too narrow across the shoulders, which she found so specifically and endearingly him that she had to look away when he came up the aisle because looking at him directly was too much. When the minister asked if she took this man, she said yes in a voice that did not waver once, and when Owen took her hand to place the ring, a simple gold band that had belonged to their mother, and that Owen's mother had sent from Missouri with a letter that said she was glad he had found someone, and that she hoped to meet Jennie in the spring. She felt the ring settle on her finger with the particular solidity of a thing that is in its right place. They spent their wedding night at the farm, which was, after all, their home, and the world they built in it in the months that followed was built deliberately, and with full knowledge of what they were doing and who they were to each other, which is the best possible foundation for a world. The winter was a hard one. There was a blizzard in February that came down from the north with a ferocity that pushed snow through the gaps in the window frames and drifted so deep against the barn door that Owen spent 2 hours with a shovel before he could get through to the animals. Jennie taught school when the weather permitted and stayed home when it didn't, and on the snowbound days she graded papers at the kitchen table while Owen worked the accounts or repaired equipment by the stove, and they talked intermittently about everything and nothing. A book she was reading to the older students, the spring work that needed planning, whether the creek would flood when the melt came. She wrote to her father in Tennessee, a letter more honest than any she had sent since leaving, telling him about the chain of events and about Owen, and about the life she had made. He wrote back a month later, stiffly and with some evident difficulty, but he wrote, and he said he was glad she had found something good, and that her mother would have approved of a man who was solid, which was his highest term of approbation. Owen wrote to his mother in Missouri and described Jennie in the particular careful way he had with letters, and his mother's reply came thick with affection and questions that made Owen read parts of it aloud at breakfast in a tone of fond exasperation. "She wants to know if you can cook biscuits," he said. "Tell her yes," Jennie said. "She wants to know what your flower garden looks like. Tell her it was a disaster when I arrived, but I've been working on it. She says she has a recipe for preserving elderberries that was your grandmother's and she wants to send it. Tell her, please." Owen looked up at her over the letter with a warmth in his expression that she could still stop her breath with, even after months. "She's going to love you," he said. "Is that good or bad?" "It's good," he said. "She's the best judge of people I know." Spring came with all the particular violence and beauty of a Kansas spring, storms that turned the sky green and drove hail against the windows like thrown gravel, and then days of such specific clarity that the land looked as if it had been newly made. The creek flooded mildly and receded without causing damage, which Owen greeted with the particular relief of a man who had seen a bad flood and knows what a mild one means. His mother arrived in May. Ellen Wells was a woman in her late 50s with gray-streaked hair and Owen's dark eyes, and the posture of someone who had decided long ago that the world would have to manage without her bowing to it. She stepped off the stage in Harlan Creek, took Jennie's measure in approximately 30 seconds, and then embraced her with a warmth so complete and unqualified that Jennie felt something give way inside her chest in the vicinity of where she had been quietly missing her own mother. "You're exactly right," Ellen said, which was apparently her highest term of approbation, and Jennie understood where Owen had gotten his quality of compressing maximum meaning into minimum words. Ellen stayed 6 weeks. She taught Jennie the elderberry preserving recipe and told her stories about Owen as a boy that made Jennie laugh and made Owen look out the window with exaggerated interest in the middle distance. She mended every piece of linen in the house that had accumulated rips or tears without anyone noticing, because she had the kind of hands that could not be near a mending basket without acting on it. She told Jennie about Thomas, the real Thomas, stories that filled in the outline Jennie had only had, and she cried once while telling one of them, and Jennie held her hand, and that was how they became, finally, something more than polite. Before she left, Ellen took Jennie aside on the back porch in the early morning when Owen was already out with the cattle. "He's a serious man," she said of Owen, in the way that only comes from having been young and careless and learning better. "He won't be easy all the time. He'll go quiet when he's worried and he'll work himself half to death before he admits he needs help. But he will love you with everything he has and he will never stop." She paused. "He already is. I can see it in the way he is around you. He looks complete. He hasn't looked complete in a very long time." "I know," Jennie said softly. "I know." Ellen squeezed her hand once and then stood up and went inside to finish her packing, and that was the end of the conversation, which was exactly the right length. That summer Jennie became pregnant, which she discovered on a morning in June when the knowledge arrived with a certainty that preceded any confirming evidence, the way some knowledge does. She told Owen that evening on the back porch, and he went very still in the way he went still when something was too large for his ordinary expressions to contain. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Very nearly," she said. "I'll know more in another few weeks, but yes, I'm quite certain." He reached for her hand and held it, and for a long moment he did not speak, and when he looked at her there was something in his face that she had not seen there before, a quality so unguarded and so full that she felt the sight of it press against the back of her eyes. "Jennie," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you," he said. "I know I don't say it as often as I should. I know I've never been easy with the words, but I want you to know it right now. I love you. I'm going to love this baby. I'm going to—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't let myself want this for a long time. I thought it was just something that wasn't going to happen for me, and then you came. I came to marry a dead man," she said, with the particular dark humor that had developed between them over months of shared honesty. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Yes, and I found you instead. And I found you," he said, "instead." The doctor who served Harlan Creek was a man named Weston who had trained in Philadelphia and come west for reasons he was vague about but which had to do, Jennie suspected, with a fundamental preference for places where the work was more straightforward. He confirmed the pregnancy in August and told her she was in good health and that everything looked well, and that she should expect the baby in late February or early March. She taught through the fall and into December, the children noticing her changing shape and asking about it with the frank curiosity of children who have grown up around livestock and understand reproduction as a basic aspect of nature rather than a subject requiring circumlocution. She answered their questions honestly and at the appropriate level of detail, which they found satisfying. May Hollister, the 11-year-old who read everything Jennie gave her and then wanted more, announced gravely that she intended to become a doctor, and Jennie told her she should absolutely do that and meant it. Owen was quietly and continuously attentive throughout the pregnancy in a way that was characteristic of him, not dramatic, not hovering, but present in practical ways that made her life easier without making her feel managed. He took over the heavier work of the kitchen garden. He drove her to town when the weather was bad rather than letting her take Cora alone. He read to her in the evenings when her back ached too much for sitting at the table, pulling his chair closer to her, and opening whatever book she was currently engaged with, and reading aloud in that low, steady voice that she had decided was the best voice she had ever heard anything read in. She stopped teaching in January, which she found harder than expected. The schoolroom had become a space she felt profoundly herself in, and its absence left a gap in the days that she filled with preparation for the baby, and when her energy allowed, writing long letters to Ellen and to Bess, and to her father in Tennessee. The baby arrived in the last days of February, 1881, on a night when the wind was up and the cottonwood branches were throwing shadows against the bedroom window. It was a hard labor but not a dangerous one, and the Dr. Weston was there, and Bess Briggs sat with Jennie through the night with the calm competence of a woman who had gone through it herself and knew that it was survivable. Owen was outside the bedroom door for the entire duration, and she knew it because she could hear him at intervals, the particular quality of footsteps that pace rather than walk, and it both exasperated and moved her simultaneously. The baby was a boy. He was healthy and round-faced and furious about the transition from one state of existence to another, which Bess said was an excellent sign. Jennie held him and felt something she had no adequate language for, something too large and too specific at the same time, and she thought about her mother and about Ellen, who would have to be written to immediately, and about the particular shape of the life she was living. When Owen was allowed in, he stopped in the doorway for a long moment looking at her and the baby, and she watched his face do that thing it did sometimes when something was too large for his ordinary expressions, the stillness and the depth of it. He came to the bed and sat beside her, and she put the baby in his arms and showed him how to support the head, and Owen held his son with a careful intensity that spoke of a man who understood he was holding something both enormous and fragile and intended to do it correctly. "What should we call him?" she asked. Owen looked at the baby's face, which was dark-haired and unrevealing in the way of new babies, all possibility and very little yet distinguishable. "Thomas," Owen said quietly. "If you don't mind." She had thought he might say it. She had turned it over in her own mind during the latter months and had come to the same place. "I don't mind," she said. "I think it's right." "It keeps him real," Owen said. "He was real. He deserves to be kept real." "Thomas Wells," she said, trying the baby's name on the air between them. "Thomas Owen Wells," Owen said. "If that's acceptable." "More than acceptable," she said. Owen looked at her over the baby's head with everything in his eyes that he had always had difficulty putting into words, and she looked back and the January wind moved through the cottonwoods outside, and the lamp threw warm yellow light across all three of them. Over the years that followed, the farm grew. Owen added 2 hands in the spring of 1882, young men named Davy and Colt, who were respectively 19 and 23, and who brought with them a useful competence and an inexhaustible appetite. The cattle operation expanded carefully, never beyond what the land and the water could support, because Owen had learned from watching other men overextend themselves, and he was not a man who needed to make the same mistake twice. Jennie returned to the school in the fall of 1881 when Thomas was 7 months old, and Mrs. Alderman's daughter Clara, 16 and responsible, took him during the school hours with a cheerful competence that put Jennie's mind at rest. May Hollister, who was 13 by then, had begun borrowing medical books from Dr. Weston, who was both bemused and quietly delighted by her, and Jennie continued to give her every reading challenge she could locate. They had a second child in 1883, another boy they called Henry, who arrived with considerably less drama than Thomas, and immediately revealed a character so different from his brothers that it was remarkable. Thomas at 2 was serious and observant, already showing his father's quality of taking in more than he gave out. Henry came into the world with an immediate physical confidence and a laugh that filled rooms, and from the first week, he was the boy who ran when he could have walked and who jumped from heights that made Jennie close her eyes. Ellen Wells came to visit every spring and sometimes stayed through the summer, and the house had been added to by then, a second story with 2 proper bedrooms for the boys, and there was room for her, and she had a chair on the back porch that became, without anyone designating it, definitively hers. The injustices of the frontier did not entirely bypass them. There was the question of the land rights of the Kaw people whose territory this all had been before the treaties had removed them, and Jennie was aware of it in a way that grew more rather than less present as she put down deeper roots in this soil. She talked about it with Owen one evening, and he said that he thought about it too, that the whole weight of what had been taken to make room for people like them sat in the back of his understanding and didn't fully leave. They could not fix what had been done before them, but they could be honest about what it was, and they could treat every person they encountered with the full dignity that was owed, and they could make sure their sons knew the truth of the history they were standing in rather than the sanitized version that was more comfortable. It was not enough, but it was what was true, and they held it honestly. Thomas was, from the time he could manage it, his father's shadow in the ranch work, methodical and careful and interested in every aspect of what Owen did and why. Owen taught him with the same quiet attentiveness he brought to everything, and Jennie watched them sometimes from the kitchen window or the garden, this tall man and this small, serious boy moving through the day's work together, and felt a fullness that she had come to understand was not the absence of grief or difficulty, but something that existed alongside both of them. Henry, predictably, wanted to be everywhere at once and several times ended up somewhere inadvisable, and once frightened 10 years off Jennie's life by climbing to the top of the barn at age 4, where he was found by Owen, retrieved without incident, and sat down for a conversation about judgment that Henry received with a solemnity that lasted approximately until dinner. May Hollister left Harlan Creek in 1885 to attend a women's college in the East, the first person from the county to do so in recent memory, and Jennie had a hand in making that happen, writing letters to the institution, helping May prepare her application, talking to May's parents who were uncertain, and persuading them that their daughter's extraordinary mind was something that deserved a space large enough to hold it. May wrote her a letter from the college that fall that was so full of wonder and gratitude that Jennie had to put it down twice before she could read it all the way through. She shared it with Owen that evening, and he read it and handed it back and said, "That's your work right there." "It's May's work," Jennie said. "Both things are true," he said. They had a third child in 1886, a daughter, the first girl, who came into the world at the beginning of April when the prairie was just beginning to green after a long brown winter, and the meadowlarks were back and singing from the fence posts with a frequency that felt like a promise being kept. They named her Clara Ellen for Mrs. Alderman's daughter, who had looked after Thomas as a baby, and for Owen's mother, and she was from the very first a person of strong and specific opinions who expressed them without hesitation, which Owen received with the particular beleaguered affection of a man who can see his own qualities in a child and is not entirely sure how he feels about the view. "She gets it from you," Jennie told him. "She gets the opinions from you," Owen said. "She gets the volume from somewhere I can't account for." "That's Henry's influence," Jennie said. "That tracks," Owen agreed. Ellen came in the summer of 1886 to meet Clara Ellen and stayed until August, and the two of them, old woman and new baby, seemed to have reached an immediate understanding. Ellen held her granddaughter with the ease of a woman who had raised children and helped raise grandchildren, and understood that the particular weight of a baby was one of the things in life that remained constant and true regardless of what else changed. She told Jennie on the last evening before she left that she was going to stop making the journey annually because the travel was getting harder on her bones, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "I'll write more," she said, "and you'll write to me. And in the spring, if Owen can bring the children, I'd like to see them in Missouri." "We'll come," Jennie said. "I promise." They went to Missouri in the spring of 1887, a journey that took 4 days by wagon and train, and included adventures enough to constitute several stories in themselves. Henry getting into a situation with a goat at a farm where they stopped for the night, Thomas losing, and then finding his carefully packed collection of rocks, Clara Ellen conducting a sustained and articulate complaint about the train smoke for the entirety of the Kansas segment. Ellen's house in Missouri was small and full of the accumulated matter of a long life, and the children moved through it with the reverence that children extend to houses that are clearly important to someone they love. Ellen sat on her porch and had Thomas beside her the whole first day, the two of them talking in a way that made Jennie think of Owen, that same quality of deep attentiveness, across 2 generations. Owen watched his mother from across the yard with the expression he sometimes had in the evenings on the back porch. The one that Jennie had learned was contentment wearing the face of a man who is still a little surprised to find himself in possession of it. She came to stand beside him. "All right," she asked quietly, the way she would ask him sometimes when he went to that particular stillness. He looked at her, looked back at his mother and his children on the porch, looked out at the Missouri evening, which had the same enormous sky as Kansas and the same particular light at this hour, golden and slant and full of a beauty that made the small things larger. "More than all right," he said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood there in the Missouri evening, while the children made the sounds of children and Ellen laughed at something Thomas said, a clear sound, unexpected and delighted, and the light changed and went slowly through all its stages toward dark. They went back to Harlan Creek with the spring well underway and the cottonwoods along the creek in full new leaf. The farm was as they had left it, Davy having managed the cattle and the property with the competence of a young man who had grown into genuine skill over the years, and was, by 1887, more partner than hand, though they didn't change the formal arrangement because no one had found the right moment to address it. Owen addressed it that summer, sitting down with Davy and offering him a formal stake in the operation, a portion of the cattle and a portion of the land to be managed jointly. Davy's face when he heard it was the face of a young man who had worked a long time for something he had not quite let himself imagine arriving. He shook Owen's hand for longer than was strictly necessary and then had to find something to do with himself outside immediately. Jennie was in the kitchen when Owen came in and reported this, and she put down what she was doing and kissed him, which startled him slightly and pleased him considerably. "What's that for?" he asked. "For being exactly who you are," she said. He looked at her with those dark eyes that she still, after 8 years, found she could not look into without feeling the full particular weight of loving him. "Jennie," he said. "Owen," she said. The years continued to accrue in the way that years do when a life is being properly lived, not in dramatic leaps, but in the accumulation of days that were individually ordinary and collectively extraordinary. Thomas grew into a young man of quiet depth who had all of his father's solidity and something of his own that was harder to name, a philosophical quality, an interest in the way things connected to each other, that led him eventually to read every book in Harlan Creek that could be located, and then to begin a correspondence with a college in Lawrence. Henry grew into a young man of irresistible social energy who knew everyone in 3 counties and was on good terms with all of them, who had a gift for horses that exceeded even Owen's considerable skill, and who fell in love at 19 with a rancher's daughter from 20 miles south, and managed the whole courtship with a warmth and directness that made Jennie feel she had not, in fact, failed entirely at the business of raising people. Clara Ellen, at 10, was already the most organized person in the household and had strong opinions about education, animals, the proper way to preserve tomatoes, and what Thomas was doing wrong in his correspondence with the college, which she communicated freely and did not water down. In 1889, when Jennie was 34 and the autumn was turning the cottonwoods gold along the creek, she sat on the back porch one evening in the particular quiet that descended when both older boys were occupied elsewhere, and Clara Ellen had gone to bed early after an eventful day that had included a successful but dramatic effort to rescue a hawk with an injured wing. The hawk was in the barn in a box, under Clara Ellen's convinced medical supervision. Jennie had her doubts about the outcome, but had decided that the education in both compassion and disappointment that the situation was providing was worth the investment. Owen came out and sat beside her, and they were quiet together in the evening for a while, the creek talking below and the cottonwoods moving in the light end-of-day air. "Do you ever think about the platform at Abilene?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "What do you think about it?" He considered. "I think about how you were holding those flowers," he said, "dried wildflowers. You were holding them like they mattered even though they were dead, like you were going to keep on believing in the thing they were supposed to represent even if the circumstances had already done their worst to it." She turned to look at him, surprised. "I didn't know you noticed the flowers," she said. "I noticed everything," he said. I was so desperately sorry for you in that moment, and also so aware of you as a person, which was the most inconvenient possible combination of feelings I could have had, and I spent the entire wagon ride back to the farm trying to make my conscience behave itself." She laughed softly. "And did it?" "Not even a little," he said. "But I made myself behave anyway." "You did," she said. "You were exactly what I needed you to be when everything else had collapsed." He was quiet for a moment. "I think about Thomas," he said. "I think about the fact that it was Thomas's advertisement that brought you here, that you came for him, that if Thomas had lived you would be his wife and I would have met you once or twice at family occasions," and he stopped. "I can't follow that thought all the way through. I can't hold both things at once. The grief of losing him and the fact that losing him brought me to you. I've never found a way to reconcile those two things into something clean." "I don't think they reconcile," Jennie said. "I think they just both exist. You can love Thomas's memory and grieve him and also love the life you have without it being a betrayal. Grief isn't linear and love isn't a competition." "When did you become this wise?" he asked, with the particular note in his voice that she knew meant he was moved and was handling it sideways. "Sometime around the 3rd year of teaching 15 children in a single room," she said. "It sharpens the philosophy." He made the sound that was his version of a laugh, low and real. He reached out and took her hand the way he had taken it for years now, the gesture so habitual and so specific to him that she felt it in her chest. The hawk recovered, which surprised Jennie and delighted Clara Ellen with the particular vindication of a 10-year-old who had been certain she was right. Clara Ellen released it on a Sunday morning in October, standing in the kitchen garden in her Sunday dress, her dark hair loose, her face tipped up as the hawk caught the air and went, and she watched it go without any of the dismay that was always a risk in these situations, just with a clear satisfaction at a thing properly done. "Will it come back?" Henry asked. He was home for the week and had become invested in the hawk's story despite himself. "No," Clara Ellen said certainly. "It was never ours. We just helped it along." She watched the diminishing shape of the bird for another moment, and then turned and walked back into the house with the practicality of a person who has completed one task and is ready for the next. And Owen, who had been watching this from the porch, caught Jennie's eye with an expression that said, quite clearly, that their daughter was going to be a considerable force in whatever world she occupied. Jennie was teaching through 1890 and into 1891, still in the Harlan Creek schoolroom, though by now there were 30 students in 2 rooms and a younger teacher named Miss Farrow who had come from Topeka, and who Jennie had hired and trained, and who was very good. Jennie taught the older students and the reading groups that needed particular attention, and the school had become, over 12 years, one of the things in the area that people spoke of as genuinely good, which she held quietly and with a great deal of gratitude. Thomas left for Lawrence in the fall of 1891 at age 10, going with a wagon load of books and the serious preparedness of a boy who has been ready for something for a long time. Jennie held it together through the leaving and cried for about 20 minutes afterward in the kitchen, which Owen walked in on and responded to by sitting down across from her and letting her talk about it until she was done, without trying to fix it or minimize it, which was exactly right. Henry married his rancher's daughter, whose name was Ruth, in the spring of 1892, and Jennie and Owen stood together in the church that had by now hosted enough of the family's significant occasions to feel entirely theirs. And she thought about the first time she had stood in it in December of 1879, with the dried wildflowers in her memory and the gold ring on her finger, and the life she was about to begin. She thought about Thomas Wells, who had written a good advertisement and had liked sunsets and had died before she could meet him. She thought about the specific mercy and strange grace of what had happened instead. Ruth was a capable, good-humored woman with a strong opinion about horses that Henry found irresistible and that Owen respected, and they settled on a parcel of land 5 miles south and began the business of building something, which Owen helped with both labor and advice, and which Jennie helped with everything else. Clara Ellen, at 13, was already the finest student in the school and had informed her parents with complete calm that she intended to be a doctor, citing May Hollister as evidence that such things were possible. Jennie wrote to May immediately, who was by then practicing medicine in St. Louis, and May wrote back a letter full of practical encouragement and specific advice about what Clara Ellen would need to study and where she would need to go to study it. And Clara Ellen received this letter and read it 3 times, and then filed it in the box where she kept important documents, which she had been maintaining since she was 8. In the evenings through those years, Jennie and Owen sat on the back porch with a regularity that had become the clearest measure of their life together. The creek still talked below the cottonwoods. The stars still came out enormous and indifferent over the Kansas plain. The seasons still moved through their complete and reliable cycles, and the two of them moved through it all together, talking or not talking, holding hands or not, simply present in the same space at the end of the day with the long ease of two people who have learned each other completely, and find in that knowing a thing that grows rather than diminishes. He said, one evening in the fall when the air had gone cold and the stars were very clear, "Do you remember what you said to me on the platform in Abilene?" "I said a lot of things," she said. "Which one?" "You said you had nowhere to go," he said. "I've thought about that so many times, that specific sentence. The fact that you were honest enough to say it out loud." "It was true," she said. "It was," he said. "And now," she looked at the farm and the cottonwoods and the Kansas night, and at him beside her, older and familiar and still possessed of those dark eyes that she could not look into without feeling the full weight of it. "Now I have exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said, "and the person I'm supposed to be in it with." He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them looked away, because there was nothing to look away from. The letters that passed between Owen and Thomas Wells and the woman who would become Jennie Wells had set in motion a chain of events that no one could have anticipated and no one could have planned, and it had ended here in this particular life, with this particular man, on this particular porch above this particular creek. Thomas Owen Wells came home from Lawrence in 1895 with a mind full of philosophy and politics, and a young woman beside him named Eleanor, whom he introduced to his parents with the particular solemnity of a young man who is very certain and wants to make sure everyone else is equally certain. Eleanor was 22 and sharp-eyed, and had opinions about education that aligned almost perfectly with Jennie's, which Thomas had clearly known, and which explained the slight smugness with which he watched his mother and Eleanor discover each other. Henry and Ruth had their first child, a boy, in the spring of 1895, and Owen held his first grandchild at the farm on a Sunday afternoon in May when the cottonwoods were in full leaf, and the meadowlarks were added on the fence posts, and the expression on his face was the expression Jennie had first seen when she put Thomas in his arms 14 years prior, that unguarded, complete thing that he could not quite contain. "What will they call him?" she asked. "James," Henry said. "James Owen Wells." Owen made a sound she had never heard from him before, a quiet one, held back but not quite successfully, and she put her hand on his arm and he covered it with his without looking away from the baby. Clara Ellen left for the East in 1896 at age 17, which Jennie had insisted was old enough, and the institution had agreed, with a letter of recommendation from May Hollister that the admissions committee had found compelling, and a box of books, and a certainty that sat on her the way certainty always had sat on Clara Ellen, like clothing that fit exactly. Jennie and Owen saw her off at the station in Abilene, which was a different station now, expanded and busier, but still the same platform where Jennie had stood with dried wildflowers in a summer 17 years previous. She thought about that while they waited for the train. She thought about the woman she had been then, and the woman she was now, and the country of years between them, and it did not feel like loss. It felt like something very specifically hers. Clara Ellen embraced Owen first, which surprised him visibly because she was not usually a person who initiated embraces. "I'm going to be a doctor," she told him. "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I'm just telling you again." "I'll be proud of it every time," he said. She embraced Jennie and held on for a moment longer than usual, and Jennie felt her daughter's particular solidity, the strength of a girl who had grown up with work and purpose and a mother who had shown her what it looked like to build a life by hand. "Write to me," Jennie said. "Every week," Clara Ellen said. She kept the promise. The letters came every week without fail, full of her observations about medical training and the city and the other women students, and the particular absurdities of being taken less seriously than the male students in exactly the way May had warned her about, and she had prepared to navigate. She navigated it with characteristic Clara Ellen efficiency, which meant a combination of outperforming expectations and being politely and completely immovable about her right to be there. May Hollister visited the farm in 1897, 30 years old and a practicing physician, and still the same intense, book-hungry girl that Jennie had recognized and cultivated in a one-room schoolhouse. She sat on the back porch with Jennie and Owen on a warm September evening, and they talked until the night was well advanced about medicine in Kansas and the years, and at one point May said quietly that Jennie had changed the course of her life, and Jennie said that May had changed it herself, that Jennie had simply been in a position to help it along. "Like Clara Ellen and the hawk," Owen said. May looked at him. "I don't know that story." "We helped it along," Jennie said. "It was never ours." May looked between them for a moment with the expression of a person who has understood something that wasn't directly stated, and then she smiled. Owen and Jennie sat on the back porch after May had gone to bed, in the September quiet with the creek below them and the stars above and the farm around them in all its accumulated years. He held her hand. She leaned against his shoulder. The cottonwoods moved in a small night wind. "Are you happy?" she asked him, not because she needed the reassurance, but because she liked to hear him say it, because the specific way he said it was one of her favorite things in the world. He was quiet for a moment, the way he always was when she asked, because he took the question seriously rather than answering it reflexively. "Happy," he said, as if weighing the word. "Yes. More than that, but that's in the territory. I'm Jennie, I'm exactly where I want to be. I have been for a long time, I am every day." "Every day," she said. "Every day that you're in it," he said. "Yes." She pressed her face briefly against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The creek talked on. The cottonwoods moved. The life they had built was not a dramatic life. It was not a life that would appear in any newspaper or make any historical record. It was a life composed of weather and work and children and the growing of things and the occasional violent Kansas spring, and the particular grace of two people who had found each other at the worst possible moment and had, against all logical expectation, made something that lasted. Thomas came home from Lawrence for good in 1899, bringing Alina and their 2 children with them, and he and Owen sat on the back porch together in the fall evenings in a way that made something in Jennie's chest expand painfully with how right it looked. The older man and the young man who was becoming, visibly, the older man's continuation. Henry and Ruth were settled and thriving, the cattle operation on their land growing, young James already shadowing his father with the same quality Thomas had once shadowed Owen. Clara Ellen came home in 1902, 23 years old and qualified, and opened a medical practice in Harlan Creek that the town received with slightly less resistance than she had predicted, and rather more relief, because Dr. Weston had retired the previous year, and his replacement had proven unsatisfactory in ways that Clara Ellen's competence efficiently addressed. The day Clara Ellen saw her first patient in Harlan Creek, Jennie was in the schoolroom teaching a class of students, as she had been doing for more than 20 years. She still liked the work. She liked the specific daily satisfaction of it, the way a good lesson felt when it landed correctly, the way a struggling child's face changed when something clicked into place. She thought she would do it for as long as she was able, and then she would stop, and there was no urgency about either option. That evening Owen was already on the back porch when she got home. He had a letter on his knee from his mother in Missouri, which was how she knew immediately that the news was not good. She sat beside him, and he handed her the letter, which was from his mother's neighbor, and which said that Ellen had passed quietly in her sleep, which was the ending a woman like Ellen had properly earned, and that she had left her house to her grandchildren and her particular chair on the porch to the neighbor, which was so entirely her that Jennie felt the grief and the recognition simultaneously. She held Owen's hand while he was quiet with it, and then she talked about Ellen, the specific and real Ellen the elderberry preserving, the way she mended linens, the clear sound of her laugh on that Missouri evening, the two words she had given Jennie at the beginning that had meant more than she had known yet how to say. "You're exactly right." Owen listened and let her talk about his mother the way she had once let him tell her about Thomas, both of them understanding by now that the talking was not the same as the losing, that it was in fact the closest thing to keeping. "She loved you," he said finally. "She loved you," Jennie said. "And she was proud of you in a way she didn't always have the words for, but I could hear it every time she talked about you." He looked at the creek in the evening light. "She would have liked this," he said, "what we made of it, all of it." "She did like it," Jennie said. "She saw most of it." The years moved on. Jennie taught. Owen ranched. Thomas managed the farm with his characteristic seriousness, learning from Owen everything he could and applying it with his own additions, his own ways of thinking about the land and the water and the cattle and the seasons. Henry remained 5 miles south, his operation growing, his children growing, his laugh unchanged from boyhood. Clara Ellen doctored Harlan Creek with an intensity that was legendary, and with a patience that was more surprising in a person of such strong opinions, though Jennie had always known it was there. In 1905, Owen came to Jennie on a Sunday morning in September with the suggestion that they ride out together, just the two of them, something they had not done in a while. She agreed immediately. They saddled Cora's successor, a calm gray horse she had named Dove, and Owen's bay, and they rode east along the creek and then north into the open country, the late summer grass golden in every direction and the sky very blue overhead. They rode without urgency or destination for a while, and then Owen stopped on a rise where you could see a long way in every direction, the flat country spreading out to a horizon that seemed to go on forever, and he looked out at it and then looked at her. "I was thinking about the day I drove you out from Abilene," he said. "The first time, 26 years ago." "Were you?" she said. "I thought about all the things I didn't say," he said. "I was so careful. I was trying so hard to do the right thing and not make it about me when it wasn't about me, or shouldn't have been. And I thought you were the most impressive woman I'd ever seen, standing there on that platform with your flowers and your trunk, and your absolutely matter-of-fact response to the worst news I'd ever had to deliver to anyone. I was terrified," she said. "You didn't show it. I was showing you the version of me that was going to survive it," she said. "That's all." He looked at her on horseback in the September morning, this woman who was now familiar to him in every particular, and in whom he still found the same original quality he had noticed on a train platform with dried wildflowers in her hands. "I love you," he said. I've loved you since before I had any right to, and I've loved you every year since, and I will love you for every year that remains, and I want you to know that as specifically and clearly as I can say it." She felt it the way she always felt it when he said something true and whole all the way through. "Owen Wells," she said. "Jennie Wells," he said. "I love you," she said. "Completely and without reservation. I have for a very long time." They sat on that rise in the September morning for a while, looking out at the country that was theirs, the flat, enormous Kansas that stretched in every direction, the cottonwoods along the creek in the middle distance, the farm buildings just visible if you knew where to look. The world was very large and very still and full of a light that had no interest in being anything other than what it was. They rode home in the middle of the day, and there was smoke from the kitchen chimney, which meant Clara Ellen had stopped by and was cooking something without having been asked, which was entirely characteristic and entirely welcome. Thomas's oldest child, a girl of 7 named Ellen after her great-grandmother, was in the kitchen garden examining things with the same focused curiosity that her father had had at that age, and she looked up when Jennie and Owen came through the gate and waved with the confidence of a child who is completely at home. Jennie waved back and stopped to crouch beside her and look at what she'd been examining, which was a large and interesting beetle that had been going about its business in the bean rows. "Do you know what kind it is?" Ellen asked. "I don't," Jennie said, "but I bet Clara Ellen does." "I'll ask her," Ellen said, with great decisiveness, and picked up the beetle gently and went inside. Jennie stayed crouching in the garden for a moment, looking at the bean rows she had planted in the spring from seeds she had been saving for years, the same seeds descended from the first kitchen garden she had cleared and tended in the fall of 1879. 26 years of seeds, 26 years of this garden, 26 years of this porch and this creek and these cottonwoods and this land. She stood up and looked at the house, at the smoke from the chimney and the windows full of late noon light, and at Owen coming across the yard toward the barn with that walk that was entirely his, that particular combination of purpose and ease that she had memorized without meaning to and that she would know in any light at any distance, until she had no more days left to recognize things in. She went inside. Clara Ellen was making soup with the leftover ham from Sunday, and young Ellen was on a stool at the table explaining the beetle, while Clara Ellen made the appropriate noises of interest without slowing the chopping of vegetables. And the kitchen was warm and smelled of ham broth and October coming through the window and coffee, always coffee. Jennie sat at the table she had sat at every morning for 26 years and put her hands flat on its surface and felt the solidity of the wood under her palms, the specific grain of it, the particular shape of the table that had been here when she arrived and would probably outlast all of them. Owen came in from the barn and washed his hands at the back and came into the kitchen, and Clara Ellen said there was soup if he wanted it, and he said he'd wait for Jennie and sat across from her and looked at her across the table in the full, warm, specific way he had. She looked back at him. The beetle was being explained again, in greater detail. Clara Ellen's ladle made its steady sound against the pot. Outside, the cottonwoods were beginning to turn, just at the edges of the leaves, just the very first gold coming through the late afternoon light. She had arrived at this table with nowhere to go and had found, in the strange and specific mercy of what life decided to do with you when you stopped trying to plan it, everything she had not known she was coming for. She was home. She had been home for a very long time. And she was going to be home in this kitchen at this table, with this man across from her and these children around her, and this particular slant of Kansas light through the window, for every year that remained. And she was grateful for all of it, the grief and the grace and the dried wildflowers and the platform in Abilene, and the man who had come to deliver the worst news of her life, and had looked, in the moment of delivering it, like a man who had nowhere left to look. He had found somewhere to look. He was looking at her now, across the soup and the beetle and the October light, with those dark eyes she had loved since August of 1879, and she looked back with everything she had, which was considerable, And the creek talked on outside, and the cottonwoods turned gold at their edges, and the day went on, as days do, into its own good and completed ending.